manager in resource mobilization and partnerships. And I'm really pleased to launch this new improved sort of webinar series, as well as to talk to you, I think, about a subject which is rather an important one, just on trust funds from concept to impact reporting. So essentially the whole chain of trust funds. But before I start, I think it's important, because we're doing this webinar, I think we probably would have changed formats anyway, but we're doing it within this particular context, as you know, this COVID context. So I think my first thing would be to simply hope that all of you are doing well from wherever you are, and that you are staying healthy and adapting well to the new way of working, and also sort of to your new environment. We have joining us Jihan Hakimi, who is a member of my staff at firm, as well as Stefana Thieban, who's been absolutely outstanding in putting this together. And so thanks, first of all, to them. They will be helping in terms of administration of the webinar for today. So before we start, we thought what we would do is do a quick little poll so that we can ascertain a bit about your own understanding of trust funds. And it also allows us a chance to do all the features that, that Zoom has. So you should be able to answer, they're just 2 questions, directly onto your screen. Let me launch the first one. This is polling 4, give me a second. Polling 1, there we go. I'm going to launch it and give you guys just a couple of minutes to respond. Let's see how well you do in terms of management of this, this new type of technology. So fairly simple questions, but just to ascertain what your understanding is. And so the first one is, of course, what's your understanding of trust fund management at the bank? And are you clear about how to set up a trust fund? So thus far, we've got 23 of 41. So 60% voting, very well. Let's see if we're able to reach at least 90% in terms of responses. So we've got 85% of folks who voted. And to the first question of how is your understanding of trust fund management at the bank, we have 22 that responded average. All right, so it's a good thing we're here. And then the second question, are you clear about how to set up a trust fund? 59% or 22 of you have said no. So again, happy that we're here. Let's close the polling now and begin with the presentation. Thank you very much for that. I think it's also quite important to try and keep this as interactive as possible. All right. So so first of all, can everybody see the presentation? Okay, someone raised a hand. Give me a second. Yes, Rosa.
No, sorry, Valerie. It's just I was clicking around. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
Okay, no worries. So let's start then. So this is just what we'll go through in terms of the table of contents. And we've got, I should have said at the beginning, we've got about an hour, of which I hope to spend no more than about 15 minutes. And in fact, I'll try to time myself on the presentation in order to leave time for questions afterwards. Okay? So let me try and do this and keep myself to time. So let me start off with, I think, what's a fairly simple but very important question. Trust funds, I think, as people realize, they bring extra resources to the institution for the bank's work program, for strategic initiatives and the like. They are to be differentiated from ordinary resources of the bank, of which many of you know ADF, the African Development Fund, or the General Capital Increase, or even the Nigeria Trust Fund, because they sit in relation to the institution in a different way. First of all, we are fiduciary to these funds that are managed by the institution. And from a strategic point of view as well, I think the concept, of course, of a multilateral development bank is that everybody puts money into a common pool, and access to that common pool are done under fairly clear rules, right? And so if you tick the box, you're an ADF country, you'll receive ADF resources. You tick the box and you're an ADB country, then you'll receive ADB resources. I think what's quite interesting about a trust fund is that trust funds are necessarily bilateral or multi-donor arrangement within a multilateral setting. So I think that sets them apart and makes them fairly special in terms of both the management and the relationship with the institution. It's also important to know that trust funds, they are time-bound, typically speaking anywhere from, let's say, 8 to 10 years for a trust fund. They are strategic and they're also complementary in terms of what they bring to the bank's work. And finally, where we use trust funds are in areas where we can find that they are perhaps innovative. Let's say climate change, they're a little bit of cutting edge. There are things that donors feel, or that we also feel, that we don't perhaps pay as much attention to them as we should. Let's talk about financing for women under the FAO program. Let's talk about off-grid, small-scale renewable energy for a SAFA, or even urban management and planning under a UMDF, the Urban Municipal Development Trust Fund. Okay, and so these are things that have to make sense when we agree as the bank to actually manage these trust funds. Now, types of funds, I'd essentially say there are two types of funds and then one other bucket where we can receive funding from other institutions. So the two types of funds are essentially trust funds and special funds, okay? And what's the difference between the two things? So a trust fund, okay, has a policy, which is the current policy is 2006 trust fund policy. And there are two types: single donor, meaning just basic one donor provides you funding. Multi-donor is that many donors provide you funding, typically in a thematic sector. I think what's important to keep in mind is that a single donor can also focus on multiple thematic areas. And so you can have a Gates Trust Fund that has financed a gender, not a gender bond, but a gender index at the institution. It's financed also access to digital financial inclusion. It's financed sort of other things. And so I think what's interesting is that single donor trust fund, you tend to have a lot more leeway, but also at the same time, typically don't have the type of scale that you would have. And scale, that means in terms both of donor experience as well as the amount of resources that you can bring to bear on a particular sector. A special fund is something which is established not under the trust fund policy, but under Article 8 of the AfDB agreement. Typically, these are funds that we are asked to host by political bodies, so AMCAL, the American Ministers of Water, or AU for NAPAD IPPF, and the like. What's interesting about them is that instead of your typical grant resources that trust funds typically can provide, you can provide other types of instruments. And these are things that get approved at the Board of Governors level and not just Board of Directors level. Finally, when the bank is able to be an accredited agent under another trust fund managed by a third party. So most of these are World Bank managed, but there's also Green Climate Fund or Climate Investment Fund. It means that you go through some sort of assessment. They then decide that you're able to receive funding from them. And then you're able to receive funding on behalf of your client countries. Okay, so the two basic types of funds plus the bank acting as accredited agency. The bank portfolio over the years has, I think, increased substantially, but we're still not obviously the biggest player in terms of trust funds. That would be the World Bank in terms of number and volume. But we've gone essentially from 25 trust funds, primarily bilateral, doing mostly technical assistance for annual disbursements of about UA 5.6 million, to about 39 trust funds with an average disbursement of about UA 75 million, to do all sorts of things that are, of course, in alignment with our strategic initiatives. The most recent ones you'll find here on this particular slide, but they have to do in terms of bilateral with the Rockefeller Foundation Trust Fund or digital financial inclusion and urban and municipal planning. Three key things to please keep in mind when you're thinking about, should I set up a trust fund? One is an alignment with the bank's mandate. There are many things or many resources that others would want you to manage for them, but they may not be in keeping with what the bank strategically wants to do. Two is, what are the resources that I will require to run my fund? So some funds, they end up running sort of mini front offices in order to manage the fund. You've got a fund coordinator, you can have an M&E specialist, you'll have a portfolio analyst, and the like. It's really important to understand what it's going to cost you to run this fund effectively. And then finally, who's the donor? Keeping in mind that due diligence is always required on non-sovereign entities. So if you've got a UK that wants to give you money, we pretty much know them. But if you do have, let's say, a municipality from Brighton that wants to work with you, then you need to do more due diligence to ascertain who they are and what are the risks that you would have in terms of accepting resources from them. Prerequisites from setting up a fund. We have minimum thresholds in terms of what the bank feels is at least worth its time. And these amounts, which is 1 million single donor, 2 million multi-donor, will increase with the new policy that's expected by the end of the year. And then finally, you need to have what's called a commitment letter. Before you go to the Standing Committee on Partnerships, you would need to have something in writing that says, I, the donor, I'm Luxembourg, I'm Gates, or whoever, I agree to, in fact, provide this funding, subject to, of course, all sorts of conditions, such as parliamentary approval and the like. So what's the process for setting up a trust fund? So here, I believe there is another poll. Let's take a quick chance on this. Okay, so let us do this quick poll. I'll give you, again, a couple of minutes. And off we go. So hopefully you will be seeing this at your level. I'll give you a couple of minutes for this as well. right, we've got 50% of you voting, so let's try and get to about 80%. And we can end it, and this time I also share with you the results of the polling. All right, let's get to 70%. So one more person needs to answer, and then I'll share with you. All right, let's ring the bell. Perfect. Let's end the polling and see how you guys did. So now you can see, all right, so not bad. So you've got a proposal for a multi-donor trust fund, which means you need 2 or more donors. So then you would need at least 2 commitment letters. So that's very good, as well as a total pledge of a minimum of US 2 million. Perfect. And then most of you, right, understood that the Board of Governors approves a special fund. And then also trust funds above 100 million, regardless of whether or not they're special funds or regular funds, also get approved by Board of Governors. So that's a little bit of a trick question, because you would necessarily have to go through SMCC and through Board of Directors to get to Board of Governors, okay? But that's just to say, then we would have, I think, changed that question to what's the last approval authority. But know that before you get to Board of Governors, you necessarily would have to go through the previous layers of approval. So I think that's fantastic. I don't really even have to go through this, this other sort of screen with you. But in terms of the most important bits of setting up a trust fund, the first one is probably Standing Committee on Partnerships, okay? And you would reach out to us, that is to firm in the beginning with your concept, it would give you some feedback and the like. It's most important to have this concept note, which is for clearance. Then you go to SMCC, okay? Then you have negotiations with your donors. You have legal instrument, which is usually called an arrangement. And then finally, Board of Directors or Board of Governors, depending on what you have. Okay, so those are pretty much the steps. We typically like to say to people, it takes about 6 months to a year, right, to go through this entire process. The sticking point can be this negotiation with the donors, which if you have, 3 or 4 donors or 5, it can get a little bit long. Let's say that if they don't see things completely eye to eye. All right, let's keep going here. I think the most important thing about this particular page is just coming to the Standing Committee on Partnerships, as we've said. And SCP was created in 2012, and I think it's been very good in terms of fixing people's minds in terms of the additionality of any particular trust fund. And I should also say that SCP is also the body that treats requests for just partnerships in general. So these would be memorandum of understanding. The questions that you want to ask yourselves in terms of you being a trust fund coordinator or somebody who wants to establish, what's the need that your trust fund is going to fill in the market? Why is it unique? Why is it compelling to donors? And is there something else which may in fact do the trick? And so for somebody wanting to set up, for example, something in the climate change space, we do have a number of trust funds in this space already. So you'd ask yourself, what is it that this trust fund is bringing that doesn't currently exist either in the bank's own panoply of instruments or trust funds, or something that a client can find elsewhere? What's the appropriate instrument? So we've said that we're going to be proposing a trust fund policy that offers something other than grants. So this can be reimbursable grants, equity, loans, and the like. But for your market, what are the types of what's the support, in fact, that can be borne by your ultimate recipient? And then what's the appropriate implementation arrangements in terms of staffing and governance? I will go through this fairly quickly because I realize that I've spoken more than my 10 minutes. In terms of administration and back office, of course, there's always the sort of the sexy client-facing work that everybody wants to do or everybody does, right? But then there's also just the back office, which is as important because it's pretty much your architecture. It's the support on which your trust fund rests. And so once you, let's say, go to board and you've gotten this approval, there are lots of tasks that need to be done that you have to do them before you actually can even start, operationalizing your fund. One is to open up a bank account. We said earlier on that it's important that trust fund resources be segregated, and so they don't come into the general pool or the general bank account of the bank, but every trust fund has its own separate account. You would need to sort of exist within the bank's software, and that's existing within what we call TFMS, the Trust Fund Management System. You're given a sort of particular code. You've got to have operational guidelines as well. And so let's say you are the Gender Equality Trust Fund. You want to provide technical assistance to women-empowered businesses. There'll be a way in which you identify those businesses, a way in which you vote on proposals, that you report to donors and the like. All of that is contained within your operational guidelines. And then finally, what you want to do for the year, you will need to think about that with donors and establish an annual work plan, a strategy, and a budget. Trust fund governance as well. I'll spend maybe 1 minute on this. In terms of what or who needs to approve, once you've established your trust fund, you then have activities. People come to you and they say, hey, I'm looking for money to strengthen Juba's Ministry of Finance. Hey, I'm looking for money to do a water sector study in Egypt, And once you go to a fund, the activity then will be approved depending on the amount. And the first level of approval is the Technical Review Committee, a bank-only review committee made up of different relevant departments: budget, legal, ourselves, strategy. Okay, and we approve what's called sort of like a free limit. It's 150,000 for single donor trust funds and 200,000 for multi-donor trust funds. And they look at everything in terms of proposals. You will then have an oversight committee, which includes the donors. And so if it's something which at the donor level, it then goes to this oversight committee. Governing council is also for special funds, is just another way of saying it. Then finally, board of directors for anything above 1 million. Okay, and that's the approval authority. To operationalize a trust fund, here I think we've done, or I've gone over the things that have to be done: opening of bank accounts, proposals, and the like. We at Firm also are there to provide the support and the advice that you would require. Accessing trust fund resources, there are two ways in which you can get resources. One is what typically is done, it's called a call for proposals, where the trust fund coordinator sends out a request to receive proposals for funding. So it goes out typically bank-wide, and you receive many proposals at the same time. A trust fund may also do things which are called ad hoc proposals. So this is typically unsolicited, whereas between a competitive call for proposals, there'll be a need, and you can also reach out to a different trust fund and say, hey, I'm going to need money for X or for Y. Accounting policies, really this is just to say that segregation of accounts, audit of trust funds, and preparation of both narrative and also financial statements are really quite reporting. We'll deal with reporting to your donors a little bit later on. This I'm not going to go through. You'll have the trust fund. the presentation. This, I simply wanted to let people know what this looks like in terms of a trust fund when you're in the trust fund management system. This is the AfDB's fund, the Africa Trade Fund. And in here, you would have all these line items, which are essentially the proposals or the activities that have been approved, okay? Trust fund monitoring and reporting. Here, I think the most important thing is to know that you have a responsibility both to provide narrative reporting to your donors, and I would call this sort of pitch reporting, right? This is flowery, this is to kind of show what you've done in terms of impact. Then you have numbers reporting, right, which is just what money's come in, what the interest you've gained on it, what you've dispersed, and the like. Both of these feature in terms of reporting to the donors. Both are actually quite important. And I can't stress enough the need to be proactive and communicate with donors rather than having them come to you and ask for information. This will skip financial statements we're talking about. So financial statements, here we've actually just had a slide. Sorry, I wanted to find on, here we go. Just wanted to come here and say what it is you produce. Every trust fund has unaudited quarterly financial statements. Then you have an audited financial statements, which are annual in nature. Project completion or project activity report for all the activities that are funded. And then a final report at the end of the year. And increasingly, a performance monitoring framework, sort of an impact framework, is asked for by donors. So let's go then forward to just in terms of general recommendations. I think the first thing is that you would need to count on us at Firm because we are here to provide assistance, of course, to the greater ecosystem at the bank. Second thing is to think strategically about donor choice and timing. So it's not for nothing that we require that when a proposal is made at the Standing Committee on Partnerships, that it's vetted at the director level. Because you can imagine a department may have very many competing priorities. You know, one person wants to have a trust fund, let's say for AdRefine, another person wants something on climate change and the like. You'd have to decide what's the most important priority you have for the year and then send that up. Because let's not forget that essentially you're speaking to the same donors for different types of trust funds. And some are very receptive to contributing to different trust funds, and some, you know, are simply wanting to focus on the areas that are of most importance to them. Segregation of duties and conflict of interest, I think, is also quite important. Trust funds are resources that allow the bank to deliver on its work program. It is not there to fill gaps in budget or things that would have ordinarily been paid by admin budget. And then finally, think about what you want to accomplish and what's the best way in order to do that. So here, I know that I missed, I think, a poll or two. Let me see whether or not at least the last poll is worth doing, and then we can move forward with the questions. So let me try this, stop share results, and there we go. Let me launch, so these are just a couple of questions just about your understanding of the presentation and of trust funds. There we go. Launched. So I'm seeing 0 of 67 voting. So either all of you have gone to lunch, which by the way, we don't serve lunch anymore, it's true, but I'm still heartened by the fact that you showed up for this. There we go, we're getting a couple of folks voting, fantastic. Let's see how this was, and then we can turn to the questions. Let's give you another sort of minute or so. Perfect then. So thanks very much for that. I think we'll end the polling now. We can leave time for questions. We've got about 73% of people voting. Excellent. Let me, in the interest of transparency, share the results. So you've got the majority of you, 37%, saying that your understanding of trust funds at the bank is good, and 31% very good. And then you found the presentation very useful, so happy for the feedback. And again, all credit to the team for putting it together. So why don't we do this now? Let's open it up for questions. I'm going to try to manage this by doing the hands up. All right, so let's do that, and then I will allow you to call, so at least the people can also hear your questions. All right, let's do that and start now. Okay, let me toggle. So bear with me while I find the person who raised their hand. So let's do this. Jihan, since you also have admin rights, there's a certain Philippe Dogal, I think. Ah, there he is. Ah, found him. Okay, yes, Philip, please.
Hello, good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon, Philip. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Valerie, for this in a beautiful presentation. I was actually excited to be part of this seminar. And what I've been looking for, at least, is to a large extent, I've seen it, because I've been handling trust funds in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, the Gambia, and then I have been seeing quite a lot of challenges coming from the fiduciary angle. But my question I want to listen to pose is that how do we work with the fiduciary team to ensure that the fiduciary team has gets input into the whole process before approval, so that we don't run into the kind of problems we are facing in many of the trust fund challenges. And I'm saying so because many at times, all we see is that this in the ending part of it. When the financing agreement comes in and it's legal, therefore the financial management should give their input into the financing agreement. And that is when you realize that this whole process has gone, and even on the choice of the institution that is going to be entrusted with the management of the funds, you don't know the due diligence that have been done into the selection of that institution. And most often than not, you get up to realize that the institution doesn't have the capacity to manage the trust fund. This is my question. And also this is the second one, we can probably harmonize with the policies in terms of financial management. That will also be very helpful. In terms of auditing arrangements, we have a cap when it comes to this in small projects or trust funds that are up to 1 million, which do not necessarily need to be annually audited. You can look at it. If it is within two years, you can actually request for an annual audit at the end of this in the project. If it goes beyond 2 years, then you may have to request for a midterm audit and a closing audit, so that we don't do it annually. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. So let's do this. Let's take maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then we'll respond to them in course. Okay. Let me look who else has their hand up. Tabi Karikari. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hello.
Yes,
is it okay?
Yes, please. Yes, now I can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. I add my voice to my friend Philip Dogley for his comments, and thanks again for the presentation. Initially, when you introduced it, I was wondering whether I was at the right place, because it looks like I'm at the other side of the trust fund. That is the use of the trust funds. I have projects that are financed by CleanDev. I have projects with Coafec, the Fast Track Fund, the Strategic Climate Fund. I have GAPS. I have also CIF. And all of them have got various characteristics that I think I handle it as a tax manager based in the country office in Ghana. I handle these projects with my knowledge of ADF. And so sometimes I believe that there is some knowledge about the environment of the trust fund that it doesn't come to us yet at the operations level. So sometimes affects the way that these are done. And they manifest in slow disbursement of the trust fund. They manifest in slow reporting also on the trust fund. So my question is basically to know how we can more efficiently ensure that the knowledge of these trust funds are disseminated to us, typically tax managers, in such a way that we would be able to handle it more efficiently, and then ensure that the operations are smooth sailing. And then the second, or related to that, is also outreach tools. Time and again, people approach us for trust funds. It's in our common language, in our generic letters to our clients when they come to us, the bank has got trust funds. And then we ask them to go on the website to look for trust fund. And some come with quite old information, which has not been updated. And then I don't know whether it is the right portal or not. But as to updating information on the trust fund, I think these are my 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you, Tabi, for that. So let me try to answer that, and then we can take another round of questions. So let's go back, I guess, to Philip's question, which was really on grant management issues and financial management. So financial management, so FIFC is actually part of the process fairly early on at the SCP level, so at the Standing Committee on Partnerships, and their input is provided. From there, pretty much up until the end of the legal agreement being finalized. So that's for the setting up of the fund. And if you have particular questions, and so I would say, for example, if you have a fund that's going to have as beneficiaries, let's say smaller entities who may not have as much of a robust financial framework or financial management as, say, another, a Ministry of Finance, for example, in a particular country, that's already the time when you ought to be thinking about what special arrangements can be made. So either providing additional technical assistance, or saying that you will, do a bit more hand-holding, that you might ask for more frequent reporting, but whatever it requires, so that you tailor your reporting and financial management to your end beneficiary. I think the second thing that I would also say is look at the type of disbursement arrangements that you have. We had an issue with a disbursement method called special account about, I guess, 2 or so years back. So a special account, I'm sure that you're familiar with it, but for those who are not, essentially allows you to have a first disbursement, then to provide a justification before you get to your second disbursement. And often what would happen is that you would have a first disbursement, then the beneficiary would not provide the justifications required, and then you essentially would be stuck, right? You've put money out the door. You know from the get-go that you will not be able to meet the impact or have the impact that you wanted, and pretty much you're stuck. And nobody really benefits from that particular situation. So I think it's important, again, to look at what type of disbursement methods and tailor it to the beneficiary that you have. In terms also, I think, of auditing arrangements, Philip, you mentioned that for some amounts that you don't do annual audits. So the types of audit arrangements we're talking about is at the trust fund level, not necessarily at the activity level. And so for sure, at the trust fund level, the trust funds, if you want to have at the end, an end of life audit, you will necessarily need to do audits every year, because it's very difficult, let's say for an auditing firm, to come in at the end of, say, 10 years or 8 years and do an audit over the entire life cycle without having done punctual audits through the life of the fund. So hopefully that has helped with your questions, Philip. Tabby, you had questions essentially about how do we obtain knowledge about the trust fund environment, the things that may impact as well in slow disbursements. So I think it's a kind of platform such as this one, where you're able to share best practices and share knowledge. I think the other thing which is really important is that there is a community of practice at the bank of trust fund managers and folks that you really should reach out to just to sort of exchange particular ideas. There are some very good and very experienced trust fund managers. I think of, let's say, Jean-Guy Africa or a Joao Cunho, who've been around for some time and have seen a certain number of things. And I think it's really important just so that you share information with each other. Of course, you can also always come to us as well. And then finally, we are meant to be launching a trust fund accreditation program. It's a module. It's actually 3 modules relating to trust fund co-financing, I think, on general knowledge, which will be part of the trust fund, part of the bank's own, Operations Academy. Watch for that. We should be sending an announcement sort of in the next month or so. It's finalized in terms of content, and we just need to launch it. And then finally, for information on trust funds, I completely take your point. One of the issues that we have is that we base our information in something called Trust Fund Finder on the last available financial statements, which are necessarily at least 6 months old. However, I think what's important, particularly for somebody looking for trust fund financing, is to know who to reach out to in terms of the trust fund coordinator. That information is current on the Trust Fund Finder, as well as generally speaking, what are the things that you finance? So already you can orient yourself and then come to us. And then finally, really what typically happens is that somebody sends an email, you pick up your phone and you say, generally, I'm looking for funding. Again, I take the example of Juba because it is something we received this last week. We're looking to strengthen the capacity in the Ministry of Finance in Juba. What can you do, to support us? And then we'll reach out to you and we'll work through on that particular request. Thanks very much. Let's see if we have any further questions. I see 2 more hands that are raised. So Tabby, I think I'm going to take your hand down. Lower hand, that's fine. And I've got a Caroline Ntumua. Caroline, please go ahead.
Thank you, Valerie. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I asked my question in the chat, so I could
Oh,
just repeat it. No,
sorry,
it's
yes,
fine.
please.
No, it's
please.
okay. So it's a two-part question. What are the options that the bank may have when a trust fund use proposal that has been approved internally stalls at the donor approval level? So for say more than 6 months, the bank has approved it, but at the donors, there is no feedback.
Okay.
How best can the bank manage the expectations of the potential receiver of this, this trust fund money during that time of no response from the donor?
Okay.
Thank you.
Perfect. So let's take also from Bushaib as well.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear, but it's a little bit faint, Bushaib.
Yeah, I was muted. Let me take my
You sound very far away.
Yes, I'm getting closer to the.
Okay.
Now, yeah, just to pick up on Tabby's comment on the update for the trust fund finder, I think it's of major importance to update the figures on the uncommitted amounts and also the call date. Like the next call or something, or if the call is open or not. 2 cells can be very informative for people also to take steps in terms of preparation and that. And I checked on a couple of amounts of uncommitted funds. I found them to be wrong, so inaccurate. So maybe you want to look into that. The other point I wanted to raise is the these trust funds and the donors have to really have some buy-in to this, to have some resources built into the trust fund when it's approved, to be dedicated to supervision, and importantly, also equally important, to communication of those funds. So I heard that the tradition is, when you get a trust fund, you link up with your sector department or whoever the operations department to get the funds as a task manager to, if you want to go and do a supervision, you have to get it from your director. Director doesn't want to know about this. He said, it's like extra money coming in. I didn't budget for it. It's extra work that I didn't budget for, basically. So I think there should be a negotiation opened with the donors because they have a lot to gain. If you do a PCR physically, go and do it. You can come back and brag about the value, the virtue of the project itself, and do a communication piece or something, rather than if you're just doing it remotely with some beneficiary. So I think this needs some attention in terms of success of the and the impact of those trust funds. Thank you, Valerie.
Okay, that's perfect. So let me take those 2 questions. Let me start first with Bushaib and work back to Caroline. First off, on the trust fund finder, we are absolutely committed to making sure that you have the data which is up to date. As I said, there'll always be a bit of a gap because we use numbers from the financial statements, which are necessarily 6 months late, but we certainly should have at least information, other information which is current, and so we will take a look at that. I think it's important that information be, be accurate, particularly if it's your first portal into the accessing information. On your question about funds being dedicated or put aside by donors to supervision and to communication. So we have a policy which is a minimum of 5% of a trust fund will go to admin fees. The user departments have 2 issues, I guess, with that. One is that it's an amount of money that comes into the general pool, so it goes into the bank budget, and for which afterwards the department must make a request for that. The second thing is that the 5%, even though we say it's a minimum 5%, unfortunately it's actually acted as a maximum. Donors are very reluctant to go above that. Now, that having been said, we do have trust funds that are able to negotiate 5+1 or 5+2% because they require, let's say, particular monitoring and evaluation arrangements, or because they want to hire particular people. So it's the case of the gender equality trust funds, the case of SAFA, and the like. So it is negotiation. I think it needs to us to put it back to the donor and say, if you really want us to, show the results, be able to show the impact and the like, you will need to then provide us with a bit more funding for it. And it's also for us to be able to be a bit more flexible, because when funding, when trust fund resources come into the house, I think we should have a simpler way of getting it back to the departments who've bought it in by the strength of their particular work. Caroline, your questions in terms of what to do if a donor isn't responsive, and again, this is an issue of application rather than we don't have a policy on it. The current trust fund policy says that once you have sent a proposal that has been vetted by the institution to the donor, single donor trust funds have 3 weeks, multi-donor trust funds have 5 weeks. In order for, so that if you don't respond, it's almost like a lapse of time basis, it's deemed to be approved. Now, because of certain relationships and the like, you might feel a little bit reluctant to do that, but from where we sit, I think if you do that 1 or 2 times, I bet you that the 3rd time the donor is going to respond. And so it really is that we must insist on applying our own rules rather than sort of sitting around and waiting for an unresponsive donor. And when you look at it, it's actually quite surprising, because the donors provided you money to do certain things, and they ought to be able to respond accordingly so that you can move on and get the results that they require and that we also require. Okay, so hopefully that has been responsive to the 2 questions. I'm just checking time. We're on, well, essentially 2 minutes to 2. I might take maybe 2 more questions if there are. I see one hand which is up, but it looks like it's Bushaib's. Bushaib, do you have another question?
No.
Okay, so I'll take down your hand then. That's okay. All right. So listen, I think we've come to the end of our time together. I don't see any further hands up. And I think we are going to say a great big thank you to everybody who's attended today. In spite of not offering lunch, I think there was still good turnout from you guys. And we really do appreciate you taking the time to learn more about trust funds. I think when a trust fund is run in an outstanding manner, it reflects well on everyone. And when there are issues with particular trust funds, I think it also reflects poorly on everyone. And so we're here as a resource to help you manage your trust funds better, to act as a sounding board as well in terms of when you want to do something which is innovative, when you've got questions. We field, I think, all manner of queries that come from all over the bank. And we're quite happy to do that. That's what we're here for. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'll also say a great big thank you to the team, so to Jihan and to Stefan for putting this together. I believe that Jihan and Stefan will be sharing with all of you the presentation afterwards. The webinar has also been recorded, I believe.